I'd like to now introduce our four principal speakers. And I would just say that I know all of them have incredible biographies. And if I read the biographies in great detail, we won't go too far into the conversation. So let me just briefly introduce them. I apologize for not giving as long an introduction as they probably deserve. Mike Allen, I'll do this alphabetically. Mike Allen is the co-founder of Axios, and I would say maybe Washington's most indefatigable journalist and most knowledgeable journalist about everything going on in Washington. He never sleeps, he works around the clock, and so it's always easy to get him on the phone or to get him on email because he's always awake. And Mike, thank you very much for everything you're doing to bring knowledge and information to people. You've been doing it for quite a while at Politico and Axios. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, David, for having me.
Gloria Borger is the chief political analyst at CNN. And I'm sure if you watch CNN, you'll see her on the Wolf Blitzer Situation Room show and also Anderson Cooper AC 360 and many other shows. I've known Gloria for many, many years, and she knows more about politics than virtually anybody I've ever met. And she knows a great deal about campaigns, and we're looking forward to her comments. Thank you very much, Gloria.
Sure.
Next is Charlie Cook. Charlie Cook invented more or less the idea of having nonpartisan political analysis put out on campaigns on a regular basis, and he invented and now is the editor and publisher of the Cook Political Report. And I think many people would say he's about the most knowledgeable person in the United States about what's going on in every congressional district and every Senate race. And we're very pleased to have Charlie here. Thank you very much, Charlie. And Nikole Killion. Nikole Killion is a CBS correspondent who is covering the White House, has covered the campaign for CBS, and she's very knowledgeable about what's going on in the campaigns now because she's covered both of them and covered the White House. And so, Nikole, thank you very much for joining us as well. And Nikole, your connection is working. You were worried about your connection not working. It's okay. So, all right. So why don't we just start by saying this, or let me ask all of you this question. John Kenneth Galbraith famously once said, the conventional wisdom in Washington is almost always wrong. So the conventional wisdom in Washington today generally is that Joe Biden is more likely than not to be the next president of the United States. So can each of you tell us, is this conventional wisdom wrong or you think it's right? Why don't we just start alphabetically, and we'll just start with Mike.
Sure. David, this is the time when the conventional wisdom is wrong seems to be wrong. So anything that you and I would look at, money, swing state polls, national polls, direction of the country, what people talk about online, the sentiment, the quantity, anything that we can measure. And David, you've done very well in life, in part based on things that you can measure, points to a Joe Biden victory. Like the asterisk, and in these times we always put asterisk, is that elections aren't held on paper. Elections are humans. And we found that out last time. But any one of those buckets that I've mentioned, to be upside down in them is a huge problem. And the president is upside down in every single one of them.
Okay, Gloria?
Well, I agree with Mike. We have to now, we're done talking about the popular vote. We're done talking about Joe Biden being up anywhere between 8 and 10 points. Now we are down to talking to the road to 270, which is, I think, what Mike is talking about. And you have to look at it state by state because we have to look at it in terms of the Electoral College. And if you look at it in terms of where the president won last time and where he's in trouble this time, it doesn't look good for him. If you were to just look at those 3 states that he won, surprising Hillary Clinton, those blue states, the blue wall, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, there is a reason that Donald Trump was in Erie, Pennsylvania yesterday. And that is because they're worried about it because Joe Biden is up by 8 or 9 points, depending on what poll you look at. So while Joe Biden is playing offense, they are playing defense and they are trying to plug holes right now and looking at states that shouldn't be close, but are close. And what they're trying to do is flip those states and hope that they're close enough that they can keep them in their camp. But they have an awful lot of work to do and only a couple of weeks left. Okay,
Charlie, what's the conventional wisdom, right or wrong?
Well, I think the conventional wisdom is this going to hold up? In my mind, are we going to tip over into landslide territory? I think now every day goes by that the president is this far behind, not just nationally, the 10 points, but in every single key state, he's behind at least a little, and in enough for 270, he's behind by a whole lot. I mean, that I think, so I'm actually spending more time looking at the US Senate, because right now the question in my mind is not whether the Senate's going to flip, but how big will the majority be for Democrats in the Senate. And that's such an incredibly impactful thing, because a Democratic majority of 50 or 51 is one thing, but 53 or 4 or 5 or higher is something very different, particularly without the filibuster. So I think I think every once in a while, we've only seen 2 wave presidential elections in my life, 1964 and 1980. I think we're in the middle of a third one.
Okay, Nikole, conventional wisdom, right or wrong?
Well, I would say the first lesson I learned in politics is that it's always a surprise. One of the first races I covered was the state's attorney's race in Cook County with Dick Devine, who at the time was a challenger and wasn't expected to win, and he did. So I am not going to pretend to make any types of predictions. And I also don't know that you can use conventional wisdom in an unconventional year. There has been so much that has transpired this year, from impeachment to the coronavirus pandemic to the wave of unrest that we saw over the summer to the president contracting coronavirus, which some may not have been surprised by. But all that being said, to Mike's point, yes, the metrics may be pointing us in one direction, but I think, 2 weeks is a long time in politics, now 13 days. So I would say we'd have to wait and see.
For all of you who are having a view that maybe Biden is more likely than Trump at this point, what would be your view if there had been no coronavirus or no COVID-19? The economy, let's presume, would have stayed fairly nice. Do you have any doubt that Trump would have won re-election, or would more likely to win re-election had there been no COVID-19? Mike?
Looking again at metrics and looking at the history of presidential races, how people feel, their pocketbooks, the direction of the country, the direction of the economy, all have been fantastic predictors. But again, that's paper. What we didn't see is what would have been like to have both of these candidates in a kinetic campaign reacting to contact. Voters were robbed of that this time. And that's what we would have seen in a unconventional year.
Okay, Gloria, what do you think?
Well, I agree. I mean, look, I agree. Without having a conventional campaign, COVID is the one enemy that Trump can taunt, but he can't beat it. And it was an enemy, and is an enemy that goes to the very core of presidential leadership and what it is like to lead in a time of crisis. And by all accounts, the voters, and the last poll I looked at was yesterday, I think it's 58% of the voters think he's done a bad job. They don't trust him on COVID. He picks a fight with Tony Fauci, whom they think is doing a very good job, and they trust him by more than 60%. So you have a president who the public believes has been unable to lead in the one crisis that affects everyone's life in every single way. Normally, that's the economy, as Mike is talking about, because, James Carville, it's the economy, stupid. Well, this election, it's been the COVID. And so I think that as a test of leadership, he has failed it, according to the public. And while he still does okay on those economic numbers, it's more people still trust him to handle the economy. The COVID is outweighing everything else right now. And the more he complains about Tony Fauci and the science and the doctors, and he doesn't do himself any good here. It's okay with his base if he does that, but he does not broaden himself one whit. And I think that has been his real Achilles heel here, which is he did not know how to handle the crisis. He didn't show any empathy during the crisis to people who have suffered during this crisis. So it exposed everything about Donald Trump that his supporters in the White House did not want to have out there for the American public to view.
Like Gloria, when he attacks Tony Fauci, do his advisors go to him and say that's not a good thing to do, or they'd say do it more?
Members of Congress, I know personally, go to him and say that is not a good thing to do. And they don't want him to continue doing it. But you can tell Donald Trump not to do it. So he attacks Fauci and then he says, oh, yeah, but he's a really nice guy. I like Tony Fauci, as if he's not then calling him an idiot and stupid. So I think it falls on deaf ears. Donald Trump will do what he wants to do. He is full of grievance about this election, but it is about himself. You know, when he ran in 2016, the grievance that he shared with American voters was about their lives and their jobs and the way they were being treated by Democrats. This election has been about his own personal grievance, and I think a lot of voters don't want to really care about that. They care about themselves.
Charlie, you mentioned the Senate races. Is COVID-19 as big a factor in the Senate races? And are the Republicans running away from Trump now who are in danger? Or are they saying, no, I'm really going to go down with him or stay with him, whatever you want to expression you want to use?
Well, let me try to do both of these because I frankly think that all this coronavirus talk, that President Trump, and I'll get to the Senate, but I think President Trump was facing a very uphill challenge for re-election before the coronavirus. That when you have two candidates running and neither one is an incumbent, that's a choice election. Who do I like? Who do I identify with? Who do I, strengths, weaknesses, pros, cons of each. But when you have an incumbent president running for re-election, it's a referendum up or down. Do you want to renew that president's contract for another 4 years? Yes or no? And a president that averages in the Gallup poll 38% for its entire first year in office, the lowest approval rating for any elected incumbent in post-World War II history by an 11-point margin. 38, Bill Clinton was at 49%. He was the next lowest. When you have his second year in office, and the second year, he goes up 2 points to 40%. 40%, the lowest second year of any elected president in history. Then you go the third year, and he goes up 2 more points to 42. He's no longer the lowest because Jimmy Carter had come in at 37, but you don't average 41% for your presidency, given that the presidential job approval rating is the best predictor of whether incumbent president can go. So I think before the coronavirus came along, he was already on thin ice. I think he got thinner ice as he talked about the coronavirus. And frankly, I think he fell through the ice in the debate. And, I don't talk to many Republican consultants or strategists that think that there's a chance in the world that he gets reelected.
Okay, well, thank you for reminding me of Jimmy Carter's low ratings. I used to work for him. So, Nikole, when you're out on the campaign trail and you're talking to, let's say, Republican advisors to President Trump, do they, say that COVID is the problem, or is it the candidates the problem?
Well, I think to them, they're trying to look past both, if you will. Obviously, with the coronavirus, we've seen the president continue to campaign with these large mass rallies. And every time I ask the campaign about this, and whether they think that is okay, they go back to the fact, well, they've got safety protocols in place. They hand out masks. I mean, at the end of the day, the president is going to do what the president wants to do. He wants to be out there. And that is, quite frankly, the campaign's strongest asset. As far as staying on message, I think that is another challenge for the campaign. Certainly the closing argument in these last 2 weeks, I think many would like to see be about the economy. That is something that the president often makes as his claim to fame. That the economy was great before coronavirus, and he is the one who can get it back on track. But, when we hear him talking about Dr. Fauci this week, or the 60 Minutes interview, for us at CBS News, it does take the president off message. So that being said, I think they are trying to do the best they can under the circumstances. They are trying to project a sense of confidence to the best of their ability. As far as Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania are concerned, the campaign for some time has, walked that back as far as trying to win all 3 again. While they certainly want to defend the map that the president had in 2016, for several weeks now, maybe even months, I would argue, they have said that they don't necessarily have to win all 3, which I think kind of gives you an indication of their concern potentially in those states, and that they may want to try to overcompensate in other states. They keep saying they feel like they have a shot in Minnesota. They feel like they have a shot in Nevada. So clearly they are looking to other paths if they are not successful with the ones the president has won in the past.
Well, tomorrow night we have a debate, and this might be the last chance for somebody to turn it around, let's say. So let's pretend that you are not journalists and the president called you up and said, I want your advice on how I could win this debate and turn around the election. I really need some advice. Pretend that you are my advisor, be my advisor. Mike, what would you tell him he can do to really change it with a different approach in the debate? Or what should he do?
David, something that you know about business and life and sports and politics is they're all games of addition. And that's something that we haven't seen from this president, going back to day one of the administration, let alone the campaign. One thing that I think any debate doctor would tell the president is, you got your people. Your people love you, like they are gonna vote for you. You need a couple more. What other tools are in the toolbox? What else can you say that might connect, resonate with someone that is open to you, or was maybe with you before and that you've lost, or maybe isn't excited about the other side? Play the game of addition.
Okay. Gloria, what would you advise the president to do?
Well, it's one thing to advise him to do something. I don't think he'd take anyone's advice, to be honest. I don't think they're going to do much debate prep. This is not a person who resets himself in any way, shape, or form. His friends, I reported the other day, his friends, when he was in the hospital, tried to get him to reset on COVID, say how he understood COVID a little bit better now, and he didn't do that. The reaching out, I think, obviously, as Mike is saying, you want him to kind of try and broaden his base, which is something he has never done. And I think at this point, it may be too late. So you would I would argue that at this point, maybe you want to say no harm, which is, don't tell women that the way you can get their votes is to talk about dishwashers, or tell them, women, please love me. Maybe show a little bit of a sense of humor. Maybe don't interrupt or be as rude as you were during the last debate, and stop complaining about the debate moderator and the debate before you walk in the room. But you can offer this advice to Donald Trump, and you can tell him, and maybe it'll last for one answer, but then he reverts to form. So I think whatever you give him, and maybe that's why they're not doing a lot of debate prep, whatever advice you give him is just not going to be heeded in any way, shape, or form.
Gloria, President Trump has not done a lot of self-deprecating humor over the years.
Have you noticed? Yeah.
But I've never actually seen him laugh. Why is that? He never seems to laugh.
It's a really interesting question. Privately, people who know him well say to me that yes, he does have a sense of humor and he can laugh, but never at himself. He just can't. You look at the Al Smith dinners, they're supposed to be full of self-deprecating humor. He just doesn't, he can't really do that. He can make a joke at the expense of Melania, but never at himself. I think that he would take that and see that as a sign of weakness. And more than anything else, he does not want to ever be seen as weak. That's why he'll never reset himself, because he can never admit he made a mistake.
Charlie, let's talk about the debate with respect to the other candidate. So Biden is ahead, you pointed out, and you think he's way ahead. What could he do that messes up the debate? What would you advise him, if you're advising Biden, to do in this debate to just make sure he gets through it without making any mistakes? What should his strategy be?
I think I'd get a good night's sleep before the debate. I would just be, the thing is, I don't think this election is about Joe Biden. I really don't. I think this is up or down on President Trump. I think as long as Vice President Biden doesn't, have a mental lapse and stare at the camera for 30 seconds or a minute, I don't think it really matters a heck of a lot what he says. Because I think people have hit the mute switch on this campaign. I think the previous debate, the other debate, was a time when people just gave up on him, and that's when he went through the ice, and we saw a hit on Republican candidates all over. They've done. I mean, what voters are saying is, who's going to make my life normal again? And that's not. President Trump has no way to get there. He just doesn't. And I think this is. I hate saying it's over, but I tell you what, we're looking at some incredibly bad data for him. I mean, when he's a point behind in Texas, I mean, really, I mean, that's a lagging indicator that he's in trouble. So I don't know that Biden, short of having some moment, like I don't know that there's anything that he could actually say that would change the trajectory of this campaign.
Okay, Nikole, you know people from both sides. Is it in your view, why does Biden not show up at the debate? Because he's ahead, he has no need to debate. And did he ever consider not debating? And do you think the Trump people regret that Trump didn't do the second debate because it would have been a big audience?
Well, I think as far as the Biden campaign is concerned, they've always argued that they wanted to honor the process and do the 3 debates. I mean, I was at the vice presidential debate in Utah, and you'll recall the next day, the Commission on Presidential Debates announced that they were going virtual, and then the president instantly came out and said that he wasn't going to do it. And even at that time, the Biden campaign seemed to suggest that they wanted to continue through the process. But look, I think for both campaigns, that really is what tomorrow night is about. It is, and just for the value of the voters, I think voters, even though many of them have made their minds up and that there is a small sliver of undecided voters still out there, it still is really like this last best chance to see the candidates side by side, which, as we pointed out earlier in this discussion, voters really haven't had a chance to do. They've really had to evaluate these candidates kind of at arm's distance. And so I think there is value to moving forward with the debate. That being said, they're still at odds over how it should transpire. Certainly the Trump campaign has been clear that they feel this debate should be about foreign policy and not a range of topics, many of the topics similar to what we saw in the first debate. I don't know that the Trump campaign regrets that there wasn't a second debate, because obviously we had both candidates do their respective town halls with different networks, and the president coming out of that NBC debate thought he did pretty well. So I don't think that they look at that as a bad thing. I think certainly the Trump campaign would like to see the president interrupt less, and he has been advised as such, as to whether or not he will do that. We will see. I mean, the bottom line is the president is a counterpuncher. He has said that about himself. So I think as far as the tone that you saw in the first debate, quite frankly, I wasn't that surprised. If you've been listening to what he said on the campaign trail, if you listen to how he has gone after Joe Biden, questioning his mental acuity, I mean, really going in on him, I was not surprised. I know others were by how he came off, but because this is the last chance for voters to evaluate the candidates, that he may want to walk that back. Even talking to voters here in Tennessee, which is a very red state, people were turned off by that, as we know, not just here, but across the country. So hopefully both candidates will approach this as an opportunity to put their plans forth and what they will do for the country. I think that's certainly what voters would like to get out of it.
I think if I could just add, I think the big thing in talking to the Biden people is, during the first debate, they had warned Biden, and they didn't want him to lose his temper. He has a temper, and he can lose it. And at a certain point, remember, he said to Donald Trump to shut up, which I think he might have been speaking for a lot of people. But that was not a presidential move. And that he was prepared for the Hunter Biden stuff, which they think worked against Trump because he was so mean. But I think that they want the difference to be a presidential candidate who acts like a president versus one who does not act like a president. And I think that that's That's their goal. You've spoken about stability. I think that they want someone stable, and they believe the public is exhausted by all of this. And so they want someone to show, you know, you don't have to deal with this every day anymore. I am stable. Can be a real president for all America. That's what they want in this next debate. They want the contrast to be even larger than it was at the last debate without Joe Biden losing his temper.
Okay. Mike, why are the Republicans so intent on getting Amy Coney Barrett confirmed before the election? And does it seem to be having any resonance with voters out there who are going to support Trump more because he gets her confirmed if he does?
So the why is clear, and that is when you have power, you use it. And the Republicans have the ability to do it, and so they're pulling it off. There was, David, a lot of trepidation about what might happen after the election, when you could well have a Biden win, when you could well have Democrats taking the Senate. Like, how would that change the dynamic? And I can tell you the McConnell team was very concerned about that, and that's why this rocket docket of getting her in before the election. Why doesn't it resonate? I think it does with a lot of the voters the president has. If you want to look at why he has a lot of the evangelical Christians that he has, some of the parts of his coalition that might not love the more colorful parts of the president, that's important to them. But he hasn't really talked about it that much. Right out of the gate, he talked a lot about it. And we had that chant, fill the seat. And at the next rally, like the next day, the campaign had official red signs, fill that seat. But there's a great book out, David, called How to Lead. It's a great gift. And in there are 13 attributes of leadership. And the president has some of them, but one of them that he doesn't have is focus. And I think that that's one of the reasons that the Judge Amy Coney Barrett message maybe hasn't had as much resonance as it might have.
Hey, Gloria, let me ask you a question. The networks like to call the election, you know, as soon as the polls are over historically. So are you more nervous about doing that this year because of all the questions that have been raised about the absentee ballots and so forth?
Sure.
And you're still going to be using exit polls. And so do you think that the networks are going to call this on the election night? And
No.
You don't think so?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you look at the Supreme Court decision, for example, in the state of Pennsylvania, where you have until November 6th, for example, to count all these ballots. I think that they're not, and I can't speak for all the networks. I can't even speak for my own. But what I know is that everyone is very careful, going to be very careful, and we are preparing our viewers that this is going to be a bunch of days. And look, if Joe Biden and Charlie can talk about this better than I can, if Joe Biden were to win Florida right away and that was counted early, then you'd have to say, well, the path is really, really, really narrow for the president. But I don't think any network, anytime, anywhere, and I don't think any journalist anywhere worth his or her salt is going to be calling things early. We have a lot of paper ballots that need to be counted. It is hard to count paper ballots. They come in one envelope. You have to open that one envelope. It's time consuming. Open that one envelope, then it's in another envelope. Then you have to compare a signature. There are things that need to be done that cannot be done immediately. Some states start counting earlier than other states. It is important we explain all of this to our viewers as we watch along with them on election night. And maybe it won't necessarily take days, but you know, I'm old enough to remember 2020. I mean, I'm sorry, 2000, the election of 2000. And so that took 36 days and went to the Supreme Court. So I do think that there are lawyers at the ready on both sides. And Charlie, I'm gonna hand this to you now because you probably know better than I do the state by state issues here, but they're complicated.
But you don't expect any gracious concession speech on election night, is that correct?
No, I don't. I could be wrong, but I don't.
Charlie, let's go. Go ahead, Charlie.
Yeah, I was just going to say that if you look, you think of the states from the most Republican, Idaho to Massachusetts, and of course, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania are the tipping point states in terms of partisanship. But since they are so slow, you had in 2016, Pennsylvania was called by the Associated Press at 1:35 in the morning, Wisconsin at 2:29, and Michigan was a week or two later.
Yeah.
But I think that I think there are going to be signs that we can look for on election night that'll give us some clues which way this thing's headed. I mean, if you just go by calls from 2016, at 9 o'clock Eastern time, Texas was called. I'm going to be watching that pretty closely. 9:36, Ohio was called. 10:50, Florida. 11:11, North Carolina. 11:33, Georgia. 12:02, Iowa. And at least for the Texas, Ohio, Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, if the president loses one single one of those, you can put your pajamas on. This is over. Long before he gets to Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, where he's pretty hopelessly behind now. So I think we'll have a pretty good clue. It won't be a call, but I think we'll have a pretty good, with a 75, 80% degree of confidence that we'll know who the next president's going to be.
Charlie, you know the states as well as anybody. So let's go down to a couple of Senate races. Maine, who's going to win there?
I think it's one of the three tipping point states with North Carolina and Iowa. I would say, I'd say it will be Sarah Gideon.
And North Carolina, has the recent scandal affected the Democratic candidate?
Either none or very little. That Cal Cunningham still has a 3-4 point lead. He was like 5, 6, 7. I think people are voting red. They're voting blue. And this is a parliamentary election. So I think a sex scandal, I would have thought this, I would say this, but it's had very little impact on this race.
Sex isn't what it used to be, in other words. What about South Carolina?
That's a really tough one. That's so different from every other race because this has nothing to do with the state changing demographics. It has nothing to do with the president. It has nothing to do with partisanship. It's to do with whether Lindsey Graham do voters in South Carolina trust him anymore? Do they trust anything he says anymore? And that has he just become too much of a politician? And the transition from being, given that John McCain and President Trump were mortal enemies, the transition from being John McCain's best friend to the president's best friend in Congress, golfing buddy, in a shockingly short period of time, has even Trump people in states saying, "Who are you? And can we trust what you on anything?" But I don't think I don't know if I want to call that one or not.
What about Iowa? How about Iowa?
Iowa, I think Joni Ernst's going to lose. I think Teresa Greenfield's going to lose.
Colorado.
That one's, Gardner's, Hickenlooper wins.
And Montana.
Gosh, it's about even. I think guess I'd go with Steve Daines by a hair, but just barely.
Arizona.
That's pretty much over. It'll be Kelly.
Okay, and is there what do you think will be the biggest surprise race in any state or a House race this year? Is there any surprise that you think will be the biggest surprise? Well,
the one I worry about is Alaska, because you just never, that Senate race some polls are having it really, really close, some kind of, but some things could be happening in Alaska, and we don't know. Nobody in the lower 48 understands Alaska, and it's just a hard state to poll. It's a hard state to read. I think if we were going to be shocked anywhere, it might be in Alaska.
Let me ask you about the polls for a moment. Now that I'm home at COVID period, I get lots of calls, people asking me to participate in polls, and I, of course, say I'm too busy, I don't want to do it. Who actually answers these phones and participates in these polls? And is it really a representative sample? I mean, who are these people?
It's funny. Some people answer the phones for the strange when there's a strange phone number. Some don't. But what's been helpful so far is the partisanship, and the ideology of people that are picking up the phones don't seem to be much different from the ones that aren't. My wife won't pick it up. I will. There's just not a lot of patterns there. The thing is, there's this misnomer that the polls were wrong in 2016. I don't know. The Real Clear Politics average going into election day was Hillary Clinton at 47, Donald Trump at 46. 47 and 44. And when all the votes are counted, she was at 48 and he was at 46. That's pretty darn close, I think. I think people had conflated the popular vote and electoral college vote, and you had 3 states that were wrong. Basically, 47 states did what pretty much we expected, and 3 states were wrong: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And some research was done, found that non-college whites were systemically undersampled in these polls. College-educated whites were oversampled. Now that most pollsters have started weighting by race by educational attainment, and in 2018 the polls were pretty darn good. So I'm not really worried about polling quality. They're not commodities. All polls aren't equal, and some are better than others. And there are 8 or 10 that I pay very close attention to. And there are others that if they were lying face up in a parking lot, I would pick it up only to put it in the trash can. They're just worthless.
Okay, Nikole, have you been to any of the events that President Trump has been doing at airport rallies, or those kind of some call it super spreader events? Have you been to any of them, and what are they like to go to those?
I have been, and I can say in the age of COVID, CBS News has made a decision that we actually don't go inside of the rallies. So unless, obviously there's a pool situation, but as far as unilaterally when we are covering them, so it's been a little odd because I can't cover it in the traditional sense of getting in with the crowd, but we do have a chance. I have had an opportunity to go to a number of the president's events, most recently in North Carolina, in Nevada a couple of weeks back, where I have been able to talk to people before the crowds get too large. And look, his base is his base. Most of the people I talk to at those rallies are diehard for Trump. They think that he is doing a good job. And even those who think that he may have made some missteps, I think it's still a scenario where it's a yes, but, well, he tweets this, but, I like that he says what he has to say and he kind of puts his money where his mouth is, that kind of thing. So I think from that standpoint, his crowds and his base have been very enthusiastic. And in contrast, I think that has been one of the harder things to gauge with supporters for Joe Biden. I was covering the Democratic primary at the beginning of the year through Super Tuesday. Then, of course, when the pandemic hit, everything stopped. And so we've had to do everything virtually. And so while the campaign primarily from March to about late summer did the bulk of their events virtually, it's just been very hard to gauge voters there. And since he has resumed some of these in-person, socially distanced events, I haven't had as much of an opportunity to talk to voters at those events, but I have talked to a number of voters who do support the former vice president. And really, I would talk most specifically about when I was in Nevada, which again, I think is a state to watch. And certainly many people there who once supported Trump are having some misgivings about that. One voter in particular basing it strictly on his response with the coronavirus pandemic. This was a bartender who was laid off and who feels like it was the president's fault, and this was at a time where the president came into the state, defied the state's guidelines on coronavirus, and that was upsetting to this particular voter. So I think, there are some of those Trump voters from 2016 who may be turning on the president this cycle, as has been noted, with some of the other analysis we've had in this discussion. But I would say those are kind of some of my takeaways from covering the trail. And I would say, as far as CBS News, our battleground tracker that's kind of backed up some of that data, especially that coronavirus is still really one of the top issues of concern out there for voters, and that many of them are concerned about the president's handling of them. And that's kind of what we're seeing in a lot of these state by state polls. So much of it has to do with his response, and why we are seeing the former vice president have an edge in many of these battleground states.
All right.
I think those voters that you're talking about are, and if you look at them in the polling, it's the not what we say, the non-college educated white voters, which Trump is still ahead with, but by a smaller margin now. So you can actually see that that Biden has peeled away some of that support. Maybe that support is women, but you can see that whereas Trump had a huge double-digit lead over Hillary Clinton with those voters, now that has shrunk to a degree with Joe Biden, depending what part of the country you're in. So he is peeling away some of that support. Some of those voters are saying, I made a mistake. Lots of those voters may be women, but there is this sense of buyer's remorse out there. We just don't know how large it is or how it'll impact the electoral landscape until we really start getting some.
If the 15th Amendment were repealed and the 19th Amendment were repealed, 15th gave former slaves the right to vote and 19th gave women the right to vote, Trump would be ahead, right? It was basically a white male vote.
Let's just say the gender gap is a chasm right now.
Right.
And he's not doing well with minority voters.
Right. So, Mike, let me ask you a question. Let's suppose we don't know who the winner is on election night, and it goes into the courts like it did in 2000. There's a theory that it could go to the House of Representatives. Can you explain how Trump could win the election that way? Because a majority of delegations are controlled by Republicans right now, 26 to 24. Could that theoretically get Trump elected that way?
It could, if you stipulate to a lot of intervening steps, and the mechanics of it are that if it really remains a tie, if it really remains a jump ball, ultimately it's decided by the House, where the state delegations choose one by one. And you're right, like the math from that, there turns out to be more Republicans than Democrats. If you look at what's going to happen in the shorter term, some sort of more likely post-election scenarios. We did a segment on Axios on HBO about the red mirage. And the red mirage is that if you look at both public opinion polling and modeling based on past elections, you find that Democrats much more likely to vote by mail, 70-30-ish, 60-40-ish. Republicans much more likely to vote in person, the exact flip. Further, Axios polling shows the more you hate Trump, the more likely you are to vote by mail. And so when you look at Michigan, Pennsylvania, some of these states that take a while to report, that means that on election night, as we're looking at Gloria's magic wall, the country may look a lot redder than it does ultimately. Now, an asterisk to that is that Florida reports quickly. And as Charlie pointed out, without Florida, you can put on your pajamas if you're a Republican. But that the red mirage comes from the fact that map an election night next day may look a lot redder than it turns out. But here's an underappreciated part of red mirage, and that is that when you vote by mail, it's a lot easier to mess up your ballot than it is in person. In person, that's a lot of the mistakes. When you vote by mail, like if you don't get it witnessed correctly, in Pennsylvania, we learned the great term, the naked ballots, which unfortunately turn out to be less exciting than they sound. Naked ballot means you forgot to include the internal envelope, almost like a wedding invitation. It needs that. So a certain percentage of those are going to be thrown out. And based on that polling, the more likely you are to vote Biden, the more likely you are to vote by mail, the more likely it is to be thrown out. So that is a little bit of an asterisk USA Today estimated 1 million ballots could be thrown out that way.
Mike, let me ask you, the people that are waiting 11 hours to vote, standing in line 11 hours, are they Trump voters or are they Biden voters?
I don't think we know, and somebody else, one of my colleagues here may disagree with this. Definitely we've seen a lot of both early, and we're seeing the intensity in all kinds of ways, not just the number that are voting early, the fact that they're waiting, so much signs of intensity on both sides. But David, I have to make one point about this. We talked about some of the gifts that the president was missing, something that he has that's underappreciated. And if all of us turn out to be wrong, if the asterisk that I gave at the beginning turns out to be controlling, if it turns out that the president wins a second upset, and you bring us all back and you say, explain why. The number one thing that I will point to is the intensity, the excitement of his voters that you see in those rallies that Nikole was talking about. You go out there and you see like Trump boats, the boat capades, the flotillas, the Trump golf cart parades, the Trump car rallies. I went into, for my newsletter, Axios AM, I went into Getty Images to get a picture of a Trump flag. And there were all these people wearing Trump flags. And David, you all know there was nobody wearing Jimmy Carter flags or Obama flags or George W. Bush flags. So the people that he had have a consistency and an intensity that any politician would envy.
Okay, Gloria, let me ask you, if Trump were to lose, do you expect that he would ever invite Biden to the White House for the traditional meeting afterwards? And do you expect that there would ever be any kind of shaking of hands or anything between them two?
I cannot predict anything that Donald Trump would or would not do. I know that he did not unveil the Obama portrait in the White House. It's hard for me. The word magnanimous and Donald Trump normally don't sort of go together. I just can't predict. There is a weird part of me that thinks that sometimes if you listen to Donald Trump, and Nikole can probably talk about this better than I can, he says things like, I don't need this job. I had a happy life before this. And now he's going out there and doing the exact opposite of what all of his advisors are telling him to do. So I'm wondering if in the back of his head, he's kind of trying to figure out a way to move beyond this. I don't know. I mean, I've absolutely no idea, and I have no degree in psychology, nor do I want one. So I think that how gracious he would be to Joe Biden, obviously the knee-jerk reaction is, yeah, he wouldn't be gracious at all. But he's also an entertainer, and he kind of understands that. So I don't know the answer to that. I do know that.
I would add, they did have a conversation a couple of months back. I feel like it was not too long after the former vice president became the Democratic nominee, or sometime thereafter. But both were actually quite complimentary of the discussion that they had, although now, they've gone to their separate corners. The other thing that I would just point out too is I think both candidates have given thought to the prospect of both winning and losing. And I think we've heard from the former vice president. He said that he would go back to teaching and, maybe being a professor and, working on issues of civility. And, if you listen closely enough to the president, he too has made comments. I mean, most recently kind of in a joking matter, like, how could I lose? What would happen? Maybe I'd have to leave the country. But on a more serious level, he has made some remarks over time about the prospects of that and kind of going back to that former life that he had. So I think both candidates, despite what they may say publicly and try to portray, I think both have given some real thoughts to it too.
Okay. All right, Charlie, we didn't mention the House. Is the House going to go more Democratic than before? And will there be a majority of Democratic delegations in case it goes to the House?
Well, in the House, we if you count it up, you do the sort of micro political race by race, all 435. You come up with David Wasserman, our House editor, estimates about a Republican loss of about 10 seats. Now, which isn't much, except that when it's on top of 40 40 in 2018, that actually is a whole lot. So say 5 seats, give or take that. But if you take more of the macro and you kind of look down at it, and sort of factor in environmental, I think it's actually going to go north of that. And I've had a Republicans say that if they could get out of this with a 10-seat loss, it'd be a miracle. So in this kind of year, the macro kind of works better. In normal years, it's the race by race count. So I think it's going to be, they'll be losing more than 10 seats.
Okay, we're on pretty much out of time, so let me just ask you a final question. What do you think the final electoral vote will be? So you need 270 votes to win. Let's just go down, Charlie, let's go with you. How many do you think Biden will win? How many votes do you think he will get?
I think Biden will be closer to 400 than to 300 electoral votes.
Wow. Mike?
I never disagree with Charlie Cook on electoral votes.
All right. Gloria?
I'm not going to bite. I've absolutely no idea. And I'm not going to bite on that one, David. Sorry, I can't.
Okay.
No.
Oh, any biting
Yeah,
on
I would
that?
probably say the same too, since I'll be covering election night. What I can say, I believe our battleground tracker has the latest numbers at like 279. I'm trying to look it up. 279 and for Biden, 163 for Trump. So that's currently what CBS News is predicting on our battleground tracker. But again, it's still hard to predict at this stage.
Okay, well, let me just thank all of you, Mike, Gloria, Charlie, and Nikole, for a very interesting conversation. I will figure out in a couple of weeks whether you're right or not, and we hope everybody fills out their ballots relating to this poll, and we'll see whether anybody is smarter than our panelists about what's likely to happen. But thank you all for participating, and I'd like to thank everybody who's our sponsors. And again, this will be on our website in a few moments. So thank you all. Good day.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, David.